Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Major drama after yesterday's Azerbaijan Grand Prix as people have spotted that not only have McLaren got a very flexible front wing, but the same applies to the rear wing as well. The DRS flap is rotating on the McLaren under very high speed and high load into a position which some are calling effectively a mini-DRS, even when there's not a car within a second in front of the McLaren. This was giving, it seems, Oscar Piastri significant extra straight line speed yesterday with no DRS activated, which made it basically impossible for Charles Leclerc to try and get the move back past. Is this illegal? Well, according to the regulations, no, but many would argue this is absolutely against the spirit of the regulations, and maybe the regulators need to get their act together, because some teams may well consider this cheating, but at the same time, this is Formula 1. Teams will always exploit loopholes that they can, and this one might be a key reason why McLaren have had such a big turnaround over the last several months. Very much interested in your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. We have plenty to get into today. Firstly, Franco Colapinto has done a stellar job so far. He scored more points in the last couple of rounds than Sargent did in his entire time in that Williams car. It's interesting to think about because Colapinto was not a driver massively on the radar for many. Solid Formula 2 campaign for sure, a Williams reserve driver, but not a driver I think that many people expected to come in and do anything like he's done so far. It's only 2 races, so time will tell, but out qualifying Albon as he did, and obviously in the race was very good as well. Albon finished ahead, but solid points for the team, a stellar job, and definitely vindicates James Vowles' decision. But if Colapinto can do this, why not Bortoleto? Why not another driver? We've seen what Behrman's done, right, over the last, the 2 races that he's been in the car. So it's always a right place, right time thing in Formula 1, because Bottas is trying to keep his seat at Audi, but now Audi are thinking, well, Colapinto's nice, he's not on the grid at Williams next year because they're getting Sainz in the car, so maybe Colapinto to Audi. Sauber is a possibility, but also Bortoleto's an option, and if Colapinto's doing this, well, Bortoleto's currently leading the F2 Championship, so maybe there's something there. It's a very tricky one, and as I say, there's so many drivers that it's always going to be a right place, right time. You've got to have some sort of luck on your side if you were going to capitalize, and Colapinto got lucky in the circumstances to get the drive at Williams. Logan's crash, of course, in the Dutch Grand Prix was a big element, but also the fact that Red Bull would not give up Liam Lawson. They didn't want to loan him out because they want the freedom to put him in the car if they want to. So they didn't get Lawson. That was Vowles' option. As a result, they were stuck with, on some level, Colapinto, and he's obviously done a great job so far. A couple of interesting things on yesterday's race, actually. Piastri cooked his tyres on the first stint, trying to make the move on Leclerc that he eventually did on the second stint. And at the start of the second stint, Piastri's engineer told him, all right, Oscar, let's ease these tyres in. Don't do anything crazy. We've got to get to the end of the race on these tyres. And Piastri just ignored him and said, you know what, if I'm going to win this race, I've got to try and do it now. So he went all out for those first couple of laps. He got in front, made a stellar move to make it happen. And I think that is the cold killer instinct that Piastri has, that there are not many other drivers on the grid that have that. And arguably Lando Norris doesn't have that. I think that's the impressive thing about Oscar's performance yesterday, is that over the course of a season, am I still picking Norris to score more points than Piastri? Yes, and of course that's been the case this year. But if you gave me one race weekends and you had to say who's more likely to win, Piastri or Lando, I'd say Piastri for those reasons, and that's quite an important factor. I think it's similar for Leclerc and Sainz. Over the course of an entire season, you would expect Leclerc to outscore Sainz, but you can never be sure. If you say though who's going to win this weekend's, I think you're always picking Leclerc to have a higher likelihood than Sainz. I think it's just kind of, some drivers are built different. It is what it is. Verstappen, by the way, got no penalty for overtaking under the VSC after the checkered flag. It was very entertaining how he drove past Lando, congratulated Lando, and Lando was immediately on the radio being like, hey, is Max allowed to overtake me here? I'm pretty sure he's not by the rules. But there were loads of drivers that did it. So the FIA just said, all right, whatever, slap on the wrist, basically. Just gave them a reprimands type thing. I think McLaren did get a 5,000 euro fine for having someone in the pit lane, but that's not going to affect their race result. And also no further action between Sainz and Perez. The stewards agreed with me that it was a racing incident. So, intro to your thoughts in the comments below. I'd try and take some credit for that, but at the end of the day, I don't know whether I can really, trust the FIA and the stewards either, based on what we're going to discuss here over the coming minutes. Red Bull, however, actually have some room for optimism after yesterday's race. Perez says that they've got the speed back, and obviously Max struggled because they changed some things on the setup of his car, which is concerning because obviously when you change things on setup, you expect it to work based on simulations, based on CFD testing, whatever, and it didn't. So that's a problem. Max was just having an awful time with the car, but Perez says they made a good step. Now, that is Perez at Baku speaking, his best track by basically no doubt at all. And he was almost going to get another podium, it seems, at Azerbaijan before him and Sainz crashed out of the race at the end of the Grand Prix. But Perez says they need a couple more steps to get back, but they seem to have some understanding, Red Bull, as to where they're trying to go. And from Austin, Helmut Marko says they have a new package which should make us more competitive, probably even very competitive. So, I think Red Bull will bounce back to some degree, and whether they're going to be the strongest car at the end of the season, I doubt it. And it still seems like their car will be living on something of a knife edge where, if they get their setup wrong or if conditions change, then they can find themselves in a bit of a no man's land. But if their car is in the right working window that we love to talk about, they still can be the fastest car or joint fastest car. The McLaren is just uber consistent, really, in terms of you plonk it on the track and it's going to be fast, pretty much regardless of the circumstances. That's why I think next weekend in Singapore is critical to the championship, because Singapore has not been the friendliest track to Max at all in his career, and he's now not won Max in the last 7 rounds. Doesn't look likely to change in Singapore. It's not been a good track, of course, for the Red Bull team. Of course, last year Lando could have won it. Sainz got the win in the end. It was that incredible battle between Sainz, Norris, Hamilton and Russell towards the end of the race, and then Russell crashed out of the final lap. It was high drama, of course, last year, but it's not been a great track for Red Bull. So I think this weekend Lando needs to put at least 10 points into Max's lead, ideally more, because as Red Bull say themselves, in Austin they're going to have a further upgrade, and that probably will bring them closer, you would think. But then again, Red Bull have kind of said this before, and Marco said this before in the last couple of months, and as they've brought upgrades, even Hungary, they said, we've got a big package, it's going to be a big one, boys, and it effectively failed, right? So maybe you can't trust Red Bull's word on whether things are going to work or not. And, Max was yapping big time yesterday at all of the problems with the car, the degradation that he was having, the brakes overheating, the tyres overheating, the car being very difficult to drive. He couldn't brake, he couldn't attack the corners. One tyre was going off the ground in all the slow turns. I was bouncing. It was like driving a go-kart. So, Max weren't especially happy with the performance of yesterday's Red Bull. There is something interesting to note about this, because George Russell and many other drivers, and I've complained a lot about the tyres, I think if there was one thing that I would change in Formula 1, it's the way the tyres are not only manufactured, but probably who the manufacturer is as well, but also the specifications they are manufactured to. But the Pirelli tyres are a bit of a mystery to many. And yesterday, many drivers were finding that the hard tyre was not only lasting longer than the medium, but it was actually just straight up faster than the medium tyre. And George Russell was very frustrated about this, because at the start of the race, he was nowhere. The Mercedes had no pace at the start of the Grand Prix. Then they put on the hard tyres, and at the end of the race, Russell was basically the fastest man on the track. Apart from Lando charging through the field on the new set of mediums, Russell was cooking even the front runners on his old set of hard tyres. And Russell was the car's the same, the driver's the same, but at the start of the race, we were a second and a half off the pace, not even deserving to be anywhere near in the points. And at the end of the race, we were the fastest car on the track. So, and Russell was the only thing that changes is the tyres. He even says that Pirelli don't even understand how to make the tyres, or they don't understand the tyres, the people that make them. So, he's pretty infuriated. That's a very interesting discussion that we may come back to over the coming days, actually, because tyre talk in F1 is never going away. Just quickly on Mercedes, before we get to the McLaren drama, they did confirm, Toto, that they ran an experiment with Lewis's car. This is classic stuff. But it does seem again, after a couple of years of not necessarily being so much of a guinea pig, although, the start of 2022, Hamilton went full guinea pig mode to try and fix the car. It now seems a little bit like if they have to choose a guinea pig, they're going to choose Lewis, just because he's not their man anymore, right? You know what I mean? It's obviously Russell is their driver for next season. So, Toto says that it was an experiment they ran on his car, and it was worth running the experiment because obviously, whatever they tried did not go to plan. The reason, by the way, and another reason why Mercedes yes, they've been able to win a couple of races this year, but they're still not operating on the level of a championship winning team, really. And this is why if I'm Max, like, I think the Aston Martin prospect is very, very attractive, to be honest. But look, Hamilton says that they had some component on his car, because they had a great day Friday. They made a tiny change on Saturday, and one of the components they changed wasn't built correctly. And by the time they realized that, they'd already done qualifying, and therefore the only thing they could do was basically brake park firme, start the car from the back. So therefore they thought, okay, let's take a new power unit anyway. So yeah, just a strange error, right? To have a component that wasn't correctly built on his car, and therefore he struggled in qualifying. And then of course, you know, the rest is history since then. So, you know, just another tricky weekend for Hamilton. And I'm sure that on some level he's kind of over it. He's like, look, I won a couple of races this season, won my home Grand Prix, which of course is always the goal. And then next year gets to go to the Ferrari, the car that has been very good relative to the McLaren over the last couple of rounds. Leclerc, of course, a tad frustrated than me. He should have defended the inside line slightly better than he actually did in the ends. But this was the story of the race, really. Piastri makes the move on Leclerc. Now, I've got to say, Leclerc was, I think, 8.5, 9 tenths ahead of Piastri when they got to basically the end of Sector 2, going on to the big straight, which is basically just the entirety of Sector 3. I think Piastri was about 8 tenths, 8.5 tenths back. By the time he gets to the end of the straight, he was close enough to go for the big dive bomb and make the move happen. Leclerc, on numerous occasions, was 6 tenths behind Piastri going into the straight, but Piastri was just too fast, and by the end of the straight, Leclerc was only really once was he in position to try and make a move, and even then he was going to get run out of road on the outside, and Piastri did a great job defending the inside line. But you know, we saw this a lot. Oh, Leclerc's coming again. He's too far back. Leclerc's coming again. Not this time. So this is why that may have been the case. Now you can say, oh, downforce levels, right? Ferrari had a bit more downforce than McLaren, and maybe. But the big drama really after yesterday's race was around the, well, what people are describing as Mini-DRS. So brake boosted here. I love this. I'll leave this here at Scuderia Ferrari at the FIA, as if like Ben Sulliam's going to log in and see this tweet. But look, this is the onboard review shot. This has 5 million views here on Twitter, and this is the McLaren rear wing. So this is, you know, coming to the end of Sector 2. This is what the rear wing angle looks like. And when you go down the straight, you guys can actually see the comparison there. Even just look at the top line of where the wing comes to, and look at how close this element here is to that top line. You see how much it moves down, especially on one of the sides. And I'll show you guys a better picture of that actually in a second. But the main point is this, because this is the DRS flap. Of course, when you activate the actuator, when you're within a second of the car in front, this flaps up, and you know, you get an extra, well, it usually works out 15, 20 kilometers an hour. Obviously, if you're in the slipstream, it can then be more than that. So pretty big deal. You can actually see this rear wing element is flexing above its default position, and there is a small gap appearing underneath it in this circumstance. So it's not quite DRS, but it's mini DRS, people are calling it, and this is purely happening under high load and flexion at the top speed. This is actually a great kind of comparison shot here, just comparing a couple of angles between the McLaren on the left-hand side. And this is true to some degree for all teams, right? There's always going to be flexion in aerodynamic parts. You know, you can't make them perfectly static so they don't move at all. There's always going to be flexi wings. It's always going to be a thing. I mean, today's video seems like flexi wing part 21,000 and, you know, 35 or whatever. Like, we've had this so many times in Formula 1. But the key point really is this element here, where as it goes under high load, you actually get the flap maneuvering upwards and allowing a gap in there, which is probably, well, clearly, I would say, not in what we would call the spirit of the regulations. The wings are clearly not meant to operate like this, but given the boundaries of the rulings in the sport, this is an exploit that McLaren have been able to use. And we can see it here at low speed when the wing is under low aerodynamic load. Of course, there's always a bit of a gap here between the two elements, like there is some airflow in this gap, but you can quite clearly tell on the top side, this gap is on the left-hand side here is not really existent. On the bottom side, how much this top element flares upwards and flexes under high load to create a more severe gap. I mean, you can quite clearly see there's a bigger gap there for the air to move through and therefore generate less downforce and therefore less drag. This is another shot. You can quite clearly tell the outsides very much so flaring up compared to any other car. And this is what I was kind of talking about earlier. You can quite clearly see it on this angle, that even the actual top element of the wing is entirely flexing down. I mean, you can see how on the straight, the the line between this line and these lines is greater than when they're under a braking zone. So, this was happening, and the McLaren has been using this at Monza as well, and we're pretty sure this is a shot here from Monza where a similar thing was happening, but it was kind of less noticeable just because the rear wing there was like super low downforce, of course, because it was Monza. But this is not a brand new thing. This is another way of kind of analyzing it as well. People are calling it magic rear wing, right? Mini-DRS, whatever you want to say. And there's lots of talk about it, understandably, today. So is it cheating? Is it illegal? Well, that is obviously a grey area. What I will say is, on some level, you have to appreciate this. Even if you are like a Ferrari fan or whatever, Red Bull fan, frustrated with McLaren's progress, this is what Formula One is all about. And if you want to go watch a spec series where people don't push the boundaries, then, that's fine. But this is always how it's going to be in Formula One. Like, the teams will push the boundaries, the engineers will push the limits, they will find the loopholes, they will exploit them. And it's always how it's going to be with every single team that tries to win. If, on some level, if you're not cheating, you're not trying. Like, if you're not cheating a little bit, if you're not trying to find a way around the rules, then you're not trying to win. And genuinely, that's kind of like always how it's been in F1, and that's always how it will be. And on some level, you've got to appreciate it. At the same time, though, can you say, is this fair? Is this reasonable? Should this be allowed? And you can very credibly come up with the answer of maybe not. And that's the problem mainly, as Dr. Rob says, is how these are tested, because these wings are tested under static load. So they basically sit the car still and they put some load on the rear wing element, and they see what it does. They see if it deflects by the number or more than or less than the number that they say that it can. And if it passes, great. But obviously, they're not doing the static load test everywhere. Obviously, at high speed, you have vibrations in play. You also have possibly far greater aerodynamic load than is created by the static load tests they use on the cars. So the wing is legal. That's the key point. The wing is legal, but it is not against the spirit of the regulations, as you might describe it. And the only way to do this would be to use some sort of dynamic solution, right? Because if you're going to just load test the car on the grounds, this car will continue to pull up all the positive signs. Totally legal, totally nothing going on when they test it, but obviously on the track, you can quite clearly see that, there's something going on here, right? So that's the point. Are the FIA trying enough? Because they don't really seem to massively care. I mean, the FIA's perspective on the flexing front wings was like, well, it passes our tests. Maybe next year we'll change the tests. It is what it is. Crack on with it, right? And, this is maybe a fair analysis that the FIA, when it comes to disqualifying someone because their floor was lower than a limit, 0.1 millimeters, you're disqualified. But if your, front and rear wings have deflection, which is clearly above the numbers that they specify, but because they don't happen when they test them, then, it is what it is. And we're not just seeing things here, right? Because the numbers do speak for themselves on this. If you look at the numbers for McLaren, their no DRS numbers were higher than the other guys. They were higher than the Ferraris, higher than the Red Bulls, even though their top speed with DRS active was lower than the other two. So you can quite clearly tell that, they are gaining less from their DRS being active than the other teams are, which probably implies that they are faster without DRS than they should be, you could argue. That's at least one way to look into it, and that's kind of what Fred Vasseur says. McLaren had less downforce, and, for various reasons, and they had an extra 5 to 6 kph on the SF24 with DRS off, and that was the big factor between winning or losing, and as Vasseur says, they could have done better. McLaren wing is definitely not a disadvantage, so, look, it is what it is. The other teams will either complain and say, hey, FIA, you've got to stop this, or they'll say, all right, fine, we'll do it as well. But it's a big talking point. It's not something more than likely that the FIA are going to do anything about, and it's one of the factors that McLaren leads the constructors for the first time since way back in 2014. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.